Welcome to Hollywood Secrets Information. In this video, we're going behind the glamorous photographs and unforgettable performances to uncover the little-known physical challenges, injuries, illnesses, and personal struggles faced by some of classic Hollywood's most famous stars. From a devastating accident that permanently changed an actor's appearance, to conditions that audiences could barely notice on screen, these stories reveal another side of Hollywood history. Some were carefully hidden, some were simply ignored by the studios, and one of these stars had a condition that was surprisingly obvious once you knew what to look for. So stay with us as we uncover the hidden struggles behind 17 legendary names. 1. Harold Lloyd. Harold Lloyd was one of the biggest comedy stars of the silent film era, famous for his energetic stunts, round glasses, and fearless screen persona. But behind that cheerful image was one of the most serious injuries ever suffered by a major Hollywood performer. In 1919, while filming a promotional sequence, Lloyd was holding what he believed was a harmless prop bomb when it unexpectedly exploded. The blast caused devastating injuries to his right hand and face. His hand was permanently damaged, and he lost several fingers. The accident could easily have ended his career, but Lloyd refused to let it destroy his identity as a performer. He continued working and became remarkably skilled at hiding his injured hand from the camera. He often used a specially designed prosthetic glove that allowed him to maintain the appearance of a normal hand on screen. What makes Lloyd's story extraordinary is that audiences continued watching him perform some of the most dangerous physical comedy in movie history without necessarily realizing what he had endured. His famous glasses became an important part of his screen identity, while his damaged hand remained largely hidden. Lloyd's career is a powerful example of how Hollywood stars sometimes transformed personal tragedy into professional determination. Instead of disappearing after the accident, he returned to the screen and continued performing dangerous stunts, proving that his greatest challenge could not define him. 2. Clark Gable. Clark Gable was presented by Hollywood as the ultimate image of masculine perfection. With his confident smile, deep voice, and commanding screen presence, he became one of the defining stars of the Golden Age. But Gable also dealt with a physical problem that became increasingly important later in his life: hearing difficulties. His hearing problems were not the kind of obvious disability audiences would immediately notice, because Gable's performances depended heavily on his voice, facial expressions, and commanding presence. As he grew older, however, hearing loss became more noticeable in his personal life. Another important detail from his medical history involved his health during military service. Gable served in the United States Army Air Forces during World War II and flew combat missions as a bomber observer and gunner. The physical and psychological demands of wartime service added another chapter to a life that had already been shaped by intense Hollywood expectations. Gable's public image remained almost completely untouched by these struggles. Hollywood continued presenting him as the powerful, confident leading man audiences expected. That is what makes his story interesting. The Clark Gable audiences saw on screen was a carefully maintained image, while the real man experienced the ordinary physical limitations that come with age and an extremely demanding life. His story reminds us that even the biggest stars were never immune to the realities of the human body. 3. James Stewart. James Stewart became famous for his distinctive voice, awkward charm, and ability to portray ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances. Unlike some of the stars on this list, Stewart did not have a dramatic visible deformity that Hollywood systematically concealed. However, his physical and psychological experiences during World War II became an important part of his life. Stewart served as a bomber pilot in the United States Army Air Forces and eventually rose to the rank of brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve. Flying heavy bombers during wartime involved enormous physical and emotional pressure. Stewart participated in dangerous missions over Europe, and the experience left a permanent mark on him. After the war, He returned to Hollywood. But the man who came back was not simply the same carefree actor audiences had known before. Stewart's wartime service contributed to a more mature and serious personality that could be felt in many of his later performances. His naturally hesitant speech and distinctive delivery were sometimes mistaken for weakness, but they became one of his greatest acting trademarks. Stewart demonstrated that a physical characteristic that might have been considered an imperfection could actually become an unforgettable part of a performer's identity. Rather than trying to erase his unusual voice or mannerisms, he incorporated them into his performances. The result was one of the most recognizable acting styles in American cinema. His story shows that Hollywood perfection was often less important than authenticity. 4. Judy Garland. Judy Garland's story is one of the most heartbreaking examples of the difference between a Hollywood image and real life. To millions of viewers, she was the cheerful young star of The Wizard of Oz, the girl whose voice seemed almost impossibly powerful. But behind that image was a performer whose health was repeatedly damaged by the pressures of the studio system. Garland was subjected to strict weight control practices from a very young age and was given stimulants to help her work long hours, followed by other medications to help her sleep. These practices contributed to serious substance dependence and health problems throughout her adult life. Garland also struggled with depression and emotional instability, difficulties that became increasingly severe as she grew older. It is important not to reduce her story to the medications themselves. Garland was a talented performer placed under extraordinary pressure while still a child. Her body and personal life were treated as parts of a commercial product. On screen, she was expected to appear energetic, youthful, and perfect. Behind the scenes, she was fighting battles that the audience rarely saw. Her later years were marked by professional difficulties, financial problems, and continuing health struggles. Yet her artistic legacy survived all of this. Garland remains remembered not because of the problems that surrounded her, but because of the extraordinary voice and emotional performances she gave the world. 5. Lon Chaney Jr. Lon Chaney Jr. carried one of the most famous names in horror history. His father, Lon Chaney, had become legendary for transforming his appearance through makeup, and the younger Chaney eventually became a major horror star himself. Lon Chaney Jr. famously played characters such as Larry Talbot in The Wolf Man, Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, and the Mummy. Unlike his father, however, Chaney Jr. did not have a physical deformity comparable to the grotesque characters he portrayed. His major health problems developed during adulthood and included serious medical conditions that affected his later life. He struggled with alcoholism and also suffered from various physical ailments, including heart and diabetes-related problems. His deteriorating health eventually made work increasingly difficult. The irony was striking. Audiences remembered Chaney as the terrifying monster on screen, while the real man was dealing with increasingly serious health problems away from the cameras. His career also suffered as the studio system changed, and the horror roles that had made him famous became less prestigious. Chaney Jr.'s story demonstrates how easily Hollywood could confuse an actor with the characters he played. The man who terrified generations of moviegoers was himself facing ordinary human vulnerability. His later years were considerably more difficult than his famous screen image suggested. Today, his legacy remains closely connected with universal horror, particularly The Wolf Man. But behind that iconic makeup was an actor whose own health struggles were largely overshadowed by his monstrous characters. 6. Barbara Payton. Barbara Payton was one of the most troubled figures associated with Hollywood's post-war era. She was beautiful, glamorous, and heavily promoted as a rising star, but her personal life became increasingly unstable. Unlike some of the other people on this list, there is no firmly documented major physical deformity that should be presented as a hidden disability. Her story is better understood through the emotional, personal, and professional struggles that damaged her career. Peyton became caught in a highly publicized love triangle involving actor Frank Tone and boxer Tom Neal. The resulting scandal attracted enormous press attention and contributed to the collapse of her Hollywood reputation. Her career declined rapidly, and she struggled with alcoholism and financial instability. Hollywood was particularly unforgiving toward actresses whose private lives became tabloid material. Peyton's appearance, which had once been considered her greatest professional asset, could not protect her once the studios and public turned against her. Her story, therefore, deserves a slightly different place in this documentary. Rather than inventing a physical disability, it shows another kind of hidden struggle faced by stars of the era: addiction, emotional instability, and the destructive consequences of relentless publicity. Barbara Payton died at only 39, leaving behind a tragic story of a promising actress whose career disappeared almost as quickly as it had begun. 7. Merle Oberon. Merle Oberon was one of the most glamorous actresses of classic Hollywood, known for her elegant appearance and sophisticated screen presence. But there was a little-known aspect of her personal history involving her appearance and the way Hollywood manufactured celebrity identities. Oberon was extremely protective of her private background, and for many years she concealed important details about her early life. There were also stories surrounding injuries and facial treatments, including accounts of an accident in her youth that supposedly affected her appearance. However, many dramatic versions of those stories have been repeated without reliable evidence, so they should be treated cautiously. What is firmly established is that Oberon was highly conscious of maintaining her glamorous image. Hollywood studios of the era placed enormous importance on an actress appearing physically flawless, and Oberon's career demonstrates just how much effort could go into preserving that illusion. She became an international star and earned an Academy Award nomination for The Dark Angel. Her polished appearance was central to the roles she received, but her real life was considerably more complicated than her glamorous photographs suggested. Oberon also suffered serious health problems later in life, including strokes that affected her final years. Her story reminds us that classic Hollywood often demanded perfection from its stars while giving audiences very little information about what was happening behind the scenes. 8. Gene Tierney. Gene Tierney was one of Hollywood's most celebrated beauties, remembered for films such as Laura and Leave Her to Heaven. Her appearance was so striking that she was frequently described as one of the most beautiful actresses of her generation. But behind that glamorous image was a woman who experienced severe mental health struggles. After the birth of her daughter, who had been exposed to German measles during Tierney's pregnancy and was born with serious disabilities, Tierney experienced profound emotional distress. She later struggled with severe depression and eventually underwent psychiatric treatment, including electroconvulsive therapy, which was used far more aggressively in that era than it generally is today. Her health problems interrupted her career and caused long periods away from filmmaking. For audiences who remembered her as an elegant, confident screen star, the reality was difficult to reconcile with the image on the screen. Tierney eventually returned to acting, but her career was never quite the same. Her story is particularly important because mental illness was heavily stigmatized during the middle of the 20th century. Stars were expected to maintain an image of beauty, confidence, and emotional control, making it extremely difficult for someone experiencing serious depression to speak openly. Gene Tierney's life demonstrates that even the most glamorous Hollywood image could conceal profound emotional suffering. 9. Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi became one of the most recognizable horror stars in cinema history, largely because of his unforgettable performance as Count Dracula. His intense eyes, distinctive accent, and dramatic movements created an image that became almost impossible to separate from the actor himself. But Lugosi's later life was marked by serious health and addiction problems. After years of being associated almost exclusively with horror roles, his career declined sharply. The typecasting became so severe that he struggled to obtain substantial work outside the genre. Lugosi also developed a dependence on morphine and other drugs after medical treatment for chronic pain. His addiction eventually became a major part of his personal struggles. In his later years, he faced financial difficulties and declining health. The irony is that one of the men most responsible for creating Hollywood's image of the supernatural was experiencing very real physical suffering himself. Lugosi eventually sought treatment for his addiction, but his health continued to deteriorate. His final years were far removed from the fame he had enjoyed during the early sound era. Yet his image as Dracula survived. Today, Bela Lugosi's performance remains one of the defining portrayals of the character, proving that an actor can become immortal through a single role even when the rest of his career becomes overshadowed by personal difficulties. 10. Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn was famous for refusing to conform to Hollywood's expectations. She wore trousers, spoke with confidence, and built a career around strong and independent characters. Later in life, she developed a noticeable tremor that became increasingly apparent in public appearances. The tremor has often been discussed as an essential tremor or Parkinsonian-type condition, although it is important not to diagnose a historical figure beyond what reliable records establish. Hepburn's voice and movements also changed with age, but she continued to work for decades. What made her remarkable was her refusal to hide the realities of aging. Hollywood had always demanded that actresses maintain an image of youth and physical perfection, but Hepburn continued appearing on screen even as her body changed. She had already survived serious physical challenges earlier in life, including a broken hip in her later years, but she continued working. Her determination became part of her public identity. Rather than allowing age or physical limitations to erase her career, she adapted. Hepburn ultimately won 4 Academy Awards for acting, more than any other performer in the acting categories at the time. Her later appearances may look very different from her youthful films, but that difference is part of what makes her story so powerful. She demonstrated that a legendary career does not have to end simply because the body changes. 11. Lionel Barrymore. Lionel Barrymore came from one of Hollywood's most famous acting families and became an important actor, director, and radio performer in his own right. But one of the most visible changes in his later career was his difficulty walking. Barrymore suffered from severe arthritis and other physical problems and eventually used a wheelchair. What makes his story particularly interesting is that the wheelchair became part of his most famous screen image. Instead of disappearing from Hollywood, Barrymore continued performing. His disability actually influenced the kinds of characters he played and the way audiences remembered him. He became especially famous as Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life, where his wheelchair helped define the character's intimidating presence. Barrymore's physical limitations were real, but Hollywood used his appearance within the fictional world of the films. Behind the scenes, however, his mobility problems were connected to serious chronic health difficulties. He also suffered from injuries and pain throughout his life. Despite those challenges, Barrymore remained remarkably productive. He worked in films, radio, and theater, and continued his career long after many performers would have retired. His story demonstrates that disability does not necessarily mean the end of a creative career. In Barrymore's case, audiences learned to recognize the wheelchair as part of the image of the performer, even though the man himself had spent years fighting painful physical problems. 12. Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift was one of Hollywood's most talented and emotionally intense actors, but his life changed dramatically after a devastating automobile accident in 1956. Clift was driving home from a party when his car crashed into a telephone pole. The accident caused severe facial injuries, including a broken nose, fractured jaw, and damage to his face. His appearance was permanently altered. For an actor whose career had been built partly around his striking youthful appearance, the consequences were enormous. Clift underwent extensive reconstructive surgery and eventually returned to acting. But audiences could see that his face had changed. He also experienced continuing physical pain and emotional difficulties following the accident. His career after the crash was very different from the one that came before it. Yet Clift demonstrated remarkable courage by continuing to work rather than allowing the accident to end his career. Directors sometimes adapted his roles and camera angles to accommodate his changed appearance, but Clift's performances remain powerful. His story is one of the clearest examples of a Hollywood star whose physical appearance was dramatically transformed during the height of his career. Unlike a minor cosmetic change, this was a life-altering injury that could not simply be hidden with makeup. Montgomery Clift's later performances therefore carry an additional layer of meaning. Audiences were watching an actor who had survived an extraordinary physical trauma and continued performing despite the consequences. 13. Peter Lorre. Peter Lorre became famous for playing nervous, sinister, and psychologically complex characters. His large eyes, distinctive voice, and unusual mannerisms made him instantly recognizable. But some of what audiences interpreted as part of his acting style was influenced by real physical and medical issues. Lorre suffered from chronic health problems throughout his life and became dependent on morphine following medical treatment. His addiction and poor health eventually contributed to serious deterioration. Lorre had also experienced tuberculosis earlier in life, a disease that was particularly dangerous during the period in which he was young. His physical appearance changed significantly as he aged, but Hollywood continued using him because his unusual presence had become his greatest asset. Rather than fitting the conventional image of a handsome leading man, Lorre built a career around individuality. His performance in M established him as a major international actor, and Hollywood later turned him into one of the most recognizable character actors of the studio era. His later years were increasingly affected by health problems, including complications connected to his long-term substance dependence. Nevertheless, Lorre continued appearing in films and remained an important figure in American cinema. His story shows that Hollywood stardom did not always depend on conventional beauty. In Lorre's case, the very qualities that made him look unusual became the foundation of his unforgettable screen identity. 14. Mary Astor. Mary Astor was one of the most respected actresses of Hollywood's golden age, with a career that lasted for decades. She became especially famous for her performance as Bridget O'Shaughnessy in The Maltese Falcon. But Astor's personal life was filled with difficulties that received enormous public attention. She experienced serious marital problems and became involved in a highly publicized custody battle over her daughter. Her private diary was introduced into the court proceedings, creating a scandal that newspapers followed closely. Although Astor is sometimes included in lists of stars with hidden physical conditions, there is no strong basis for claiming that she had a major secret physical deformity. Her more significant struggles involved emotional stress, addiction, and the intense invasion of privacy caused by the press. Astor later wrote about her experiences and successfully rebuilt her career. Her story is valuable because it demonstrates another form of vulnerability in classic Hollywood, the destruction of privacy. A star could appear elegant and completely composed on screen while privately dealing with enormous personal pressure. Astor ultimately became more than a scandal figure. She was a respected actress who continued working successfully and eventually became an accomplished writer. Her career proves that a Hollywood star could survive even one of the most damaging publicity storms of the era. 15. Susan Peters. Susan Peters was one of the most tragic examples of a Hollywood career destroyed by a sudden physical injury. She was a promising young actress whose career was rising rapidly when tragedy struck in 1945. During a hunting trip, Peters suffered a terrible accident when a rifle discharged, causing a spinal cord injury. The injury left her paralyzed from the waist down. She was only in her 20s, and the accident completely changed her future. Before the injury, Peters had been establishing herself as a serious dramatic actress and had already received an Academy Award nomination for Random Harvest. After becoming paralyzed, however, she refused to disappear. She returned to acting and worked in films, television, and theater despite her disability. Her determination was extraordinary because Hollywood in the 1940s had very few roles for performers with disabilities. The industry was built around physical appearance and mobility, and accessibility was extremely limited. Peters therefore faced obstacles that went far beyond the injury itself. She had to rebuild her professional life in an industry that was not prepared to accommodate her. Her later years were also marked by serious health problems. Yet her return to acting demonstrated remarkable resilience. Susan Peters' story is not simply about tragedy. It is about refusing to surrender a career after an injury that permanently changed her body. Her life remains an important reminder of how difficult it was for disabled performers to find meaningful opportunities in classic Hollywood. 16. Frances Farmer. Frances Farmer became one of the most controversial actresses of the 1930s and 1940s, but many stories about her life were later exaggerated. Farmer experienced serious mental health problems and spent periods in psychiatric institutions. She was also subjected to harsh treatment during hospitalization, something that became central to the mythology surrounding her life. Over the years, books, films, and popular stories portrayed Farmer as a rebellious actress destroyed by Hollywood and institutional psychiatry. Some of those accounts were exaggerated or disputed, so it is important to separate documented history from later legend. What is clear is that Farmer struggled with mental illness and alcohol use and experienced repeated institutionalization. Her career was interrupted by these difficulties, but she eventually returned to acting. Her story became especially famous because it challenged the idea that Hollywood stars were somehow protected from mental health problems. Farmer's life also reveals how differently mental illness was understood in the first half of the 20th century. Psychiatric treatment at that time could be extremely restrictive, and patients had far fewer rights and treatment options than people generally expect today. Farmer's name therefore became associated with both Hollywood and the history of psychiatric treatment. Whatever the myths surrounding her, her documented struggles were real, and her life remains a powerful example of how fame could coexist with severe personal difficulties. 17. John Garfield. John Garfield was one of the most influential actors of his generation and an important figure in the development of the more naturalistic acting style that later became associated with method acting. But Garfield had serious health problems throughout his adult life. He suffered from heart disease, and his health was further complicated by the enormous stress surrounding his career. During the early 1950s, Garfield was caught up in the political investigations of the House Un-American Activities Committee. Although he was never a Communist Party member, his professional life was damaged by the controversy and the pressure surrounding the investigation. The stress affected him deeply. Garfield's heart condition eventually became increasingly serious, and he died in 1952 at only 39 years old. His death shocked Hollywood because he was still relatively young and had many years of potential work ahead of him. Unlike an obvious physical deformity, his condition was largely invisible to audiences watching his performances. On screen, Garfield appeared energetic, intense, and emotionally powerful. Behind that image was a man whose heart was failing. His story reminds us that some of the most serious medical conditions are invisible. Garfield helped transform American acting through performances that felt unusually realistic and emotionally raw. His career was brief, but his influence was enormous. Today he is remembered not for the illness that ended his life, but for the acting legacy he left behind. And there you have it. 18 classic Hollywood stars whose lives revealed a very different side of the glamorous world we see on screen. Some survived devastating accidents, some lived with serious illnesses, and others battled struggles that audiences could never see behind the camera. Their stories remind us that fame does not make anyone immune to pain, illness, or hardship. If you enjoyed discovering these hidden chapters of Hollywood history, like this video, subscribe to Hollywood Secrets Information and turn on notifications so you never miss our next journey into the secrets, scandals, and forgotten stories of classic Hollywood. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.